There is a word that appears in the Hebrew Bible nearly 7,000 times, more than any other word for God. And most people who read the Bible in English have never once seen it. It is not God. It is not Lord. It is a name. 4 Hebrew letters, no vowels, no pronunciation guide. Scholars call it the Tetragrammaton, the 4 letters. Open almost any English Bible, and where those letters stand in the original, you find 2 other words instead, the Lord in small capitals. That is not a translation. It is a substitution, repeated so consistently that most readers never notice it. And understanding what was replaced changes how you read almost everything. The God of the Hebrew Bible does not merely have a title. He has a name, and somewhere along the way, that name went silent. A quick note, because this is the second time we have stood at this doorway. Last time, we looked at Elohim, the word usually rendered God or gods, at the center of the divine council. But Elohim is a title, a category. It describes what a being is, a member of the class of divine beings. It is not a name, any more than the king is a name. Today we go to the word behind the title, not the category, the personal name. And here is what most churchgoers have never been told. The reason you don't see that name is not an accident of translation. It is the end of a deliberate, centuries-long chain of reverence. It runs from ancient Judaism, through the scribes who added the vowels, into Greek, into Latin, onto the page before you. At every link, someone chose to honor the name by hiding it. To understand how, go back to the moment it was first given. Exodus chapter 3. Moses stands before a bush that burns without being consumed, and a voice from the fire sends him to confront the most powerful ruler in the world. And Moses asks a reasonable question. In effect, when I tell the people the God of their ancestors sent me, they will ask your name. What do I tell them? The answer is one of the most debated sentences in the Hebrew Bible. In Hebrew it reads, Ehei, Asher, Ehei. Your Bible probably renders that, I am who I am. But it can equally mean, I will be what I will be. The word Ehiyah comes from the Hebrew verb hayah, to be, to become, to happen. It is not a noun. God answers the question, what is your name, with a form of the verb to be. And then, in the very next line, the text names him in the third person, the 4 letters, YHWH, set right beside that same verb to be. But here we must be careful. The leading scholar of this passage, Brevard Childs, called what Exodus 3 is doing wordplay, what specialists term paronomasia. It plays on the sound of the name to reveal something about God's character. And what it reveals is not abstract philosophy. It is relational. A few verses earlier, the same God had told Moses, I will be with you. The name is a promise of presence, not a formula. Still, this is already further than most Sunday school ever goes. The name of God is built from the verb to be. It is quite literally a name that is also a sentence, a living action, not a static noun. And yet even the grammar of that verb is contested. Read one way, YHWH means simply he is, or he will be, the one who exists. This is the older, traditional reading. But there is a second reading, argued most influentially by the Harvard scholar Frank Moore Cross. He proposed a causative form, not he who is, but he who causes to be, he who brings into existence. These are genuinely different parses of the same 4 consonants, and scholars still disagree about which is correct. Whether the name means the one who is or the one who causes to be remains open. And that ambiguity is not even the strange part. The strange part is what happened next, because this name, once given, was slowly taken out of human mouths altogether. The story turns from the meaning of the name to the disappearance of it. At some point in the centuries after the exile, what historians call the Second Temple period, Jewish reading practice quietly changed. And the change was total. Wherever a reader came to those 4 letters, they stopped saying them, every single time. Instead, out loud, they said a different word, Adonai, my Lord. The eyes read one word, the mouth spoke another. Scribes called it qere perpetuum, that which is perpetually read. A standing instruction, do not pronounce what is written. By the time of the Mishnah, around the year 200, this was codified. One rabbinic text warns that whoever pronounces the name with its letters, as written, forfeits their share in the world to come. So the most frequent name in the Hebrew Bible became the one word a faithful reader was most careful never to say aloud. Which leaves a problem. If no one says the name, how does anyone remember how it was said? To answer that, look at what the scribes did to the text. Ancient Hebrew was written with consonants only, no vowels. The vowel sounds lived in the memory of the reader, passed down orally. Then, between roughly the 6th and 10th centuries, scholars called the Masoretes, working in Tiberias, developed marks, points above and below the consonants, to preserve those vowels before they were lost. But when they reached the 4 letters of the divine name, they faced a problem. The oral tradition told them not to pronounce it, so which vowels should they write? Their solution was ingenious, and the source of a confusion that persists today. They took the consonants of the divine name and attached to them the vowels of the spoken substitute, Adonai. It was, in effect, a written footnote. When you reach this word, say Adonai. It was never meant to be pronounced as it appeared. It was directions, not a word. But directions can be misread. In medieval and Renaissance Europe, Christian scholars studying Hebrew looked at the name, the consonants of one word, the vowels of another, and read it straight through, exactly as written. The hybrid they produced was a word that had never existed in Hebrew, Yahweh. In Latin, and then English spelling, it became Jehovah. Now the popular story says Jehovah was invented in the 16th century. Roughly true, but not quite. The form traces back further to a 13th century Dominican friar named Raymond Martin around the year 1270. It was popularized more widely by Petrus Galatinus in 1518, drawing on Martin's earlier work. From there it entered the great English Bibles, including a handful of verses in the King James. And it is important to be fair. Jehovah is not a fake name or a lie. It is a sincere, centuries-old reading of a genuinely difficult text, an honest attempt to pronounce what had been obscured. It simply is not how the name appeared in the original. Which returns us to the harder question. If Jehovah is a hybrid, what did the name actually sound like? Here the trail runs cold. The tradition of not saying the name did its work too well. The pronunciation was guarded, then restricted, then simply forgotten. So how do scholars reach the reconstruction you may have heard Yahweh? Not from an unbroken Jewish tradition. That was gone. They reach for it through 2 faint echoes recorded in Greek long after the fact. The first comes from Clement of Alexandria, around the year 200, who writes the name in Greek as something close to Yahweh. The second, centuries later, is Theodoret of Surus, who reports the Samaritans of his day said Yahweh. This is why Yahweh is a reconstruction, not a recovery. There is one last piece of evidence, from the ground itself. Among the Dead Sea Scrolls, scribes copying in ordinary square Hebrew letters would sometimes stop at the divine name and switch to an older, archaic alphabet to write it. Even the shape of the letters changed when the scribe reached the name. So step back and see the whole chain assembled, laid end to end. The small capitals in your Bible stop looking like a translation and start looking like the last link in a very long act of reverence. A name given at a burning bush, then the qere perpetuum, the mouth substituting Adonai for centuries. Then the Masoretes encoding that substitution into the vowels. Then the translators who inherited the silence. In Greek, the Septuagint, the name became Kyrios, Lord. The Latin followed with Dominus, and the English Bible arrived at the Lord, small capitals that tell you a name stood here, and we replaced it with a title. And now the distinction we started with comes into focus. A title tells you about function, authority, rank, a role. But a name signals relationship. The difference between knowing about someone and being on speaking terms with them. Every time the text says the name, it makes a covenant claim. This God is not a force. This God is a person who can be addressed. That is what quietly thins out when the name becomes the Lord. Not the power that survives. What fades is the intimacy. And this does not diminish the text, it deepens it. The reverence that hid the name was not an error to be corrected. It was one of the most serious acts of devotion in religious history. To this day, many Jewish readers continue that same reverence, writing the name rather than the name itself, honoring in silence what was always held as holy. That is not a mistake. It is a living, unbroken tradition of taking the sacred seriously. And whether or not you would ever speak the name yourself, that is a question for you, and one this channel will not answer. Faithful people disagree, sincerely, and the genuine uncertainty about pronunciation is itself a reason for humility on every side. But knowing the name was there, knowing what those small capitals are covering, changes how you read. Underneath that title stands a name, given at a fire, guarded for millennia, and spoken first of all as a promise, I will be with you. So here is the one thing to carry out. The God of the Hebrew Bible is not only described, he is named, and that name was not lost by carelessness. It was hidden by devotion, until the most frequent word in the book became its most silent one. Understanding that does not make the text smaller, it makes it larger. This is the third time on this channel we have gone back to a single Hebrew word and found a whole world beneath the translation. What humans are, how God acts, and now who God is. If you want to keep going deeper into what the original texts actually say, beneath the titles, beneath the translations we inherited, subscribe and stay with us. There is far more still buried in the words.